Welcome to the Money Tales podcast, where money gets personal. I'm Cammie Doder.
And I'm Sandy Brager.
Feeling financially successful on paper, but trapped in real life, can change everything. In this episode, C-suite executive and board director Leilani Latimer shares how unintentionally becoming house poor while living in Italy as a young adult forced her to confront anxiety, control, and independence. When she sold the house, those lessons ultimately set the foundation for her to achieve a healthier, more balanced relationship with money.
Here are 3 key money topics you'll hear in this conversation. First, why thinking about board service earlier in your career can shape long-term wealth, influence, and choices far beyond traditional retirement paths. Second, how living in Italy shaped a buy less but buy better approach, turning clothing and shoe purchases into long-term investments that reflect quality and values. And third, why it's important to build healthy financial partnerships on fairness and flexibility, not rigidly splitting everything 50-50, especially as each partner's contributions naturally shift over time. Now it's our pleasure to bring you Leilani Latimer's Money Tales. Leilani Latimer, welcome to the Money Tales podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So glad you're here. We had the opportunity to meet each other at an event hosted by How Women Lead and How Women Invest. And that got me thinking this morning about some of the roles that you have being on the board of companies and helping be part of their governance structure. I love this topic because from a planning perspective, there's so many things people can do when they serve on a board. Many folks don't always realize that doing board work is compensated with self-employment income. So board members are not employees of the firm. They get a 1099 for the work that they do, which creates all sorts of opportunities. When we work with clients who are on boards, we're always looking at what are the requirements of the board. Oftentimes, there are minimum shareholding requirements. So we want to make sure that we're developing a plan with the client to achieve those goals if that's a requirement. And then we also want to understand the type of compensation. We've seen a wide array. Oftentimes there's cash compensation and there's also stock grants and or stock option grants, which creates some really fun planning opportunities depending upon the client's objectives around the stock. Importantly, something that I found a lot of people don't know about is that when you generate self-employment income, that means you have the opportunity to make contributions to a self-employment retirement plan. And they come in many different flavors. One of my favorite techniques when there's a lot of self-employment income is to look at putting together a defined benefit pension plan. And this is particularly interesting for folks who are around age 55 or older, because that's when you can make the most contributions under these types of plans. And it's a really fun way to be able to defer a lot of that self-employment income into retirement. And it opens up the doors to use that money when it's a desire for charitable giving, either through qualified charitable distributions or through estate planning. So there's so much to do.
Yeah, does it help from a tax standpoint, Sandy?
It does. So when you make typically pre-tax contributions into a defined benefit pension plan, so you can defer a lot of income. It could be $250,000 or more, depending upon the self-employment income that you're generating. I love that there are more women on boards. They're such a great, important part of modern day life, getting more diversification in the boardroom and a lot of planning opportunities.
I do think it's important to have those conversations earlier than we typically do. So a lot of women think about doing board work when they're looking at retirement. And honestly, I encourage women to think about it much, much earlier for a series of reasons. One, board work is not that well compensated. So unless you're on these stellar, public company boards, if you pull down proxy statements from publicly traded companies in the Russell 2000, you'll see that average board compensation, like base compensation, can be around $80,000 to $100,000. So you're not going to substitute your higher earning wages with board work, which is why people are on multiple boards. The upside is in the restricted stock units if the company is doing well. But as you mentioned, Sandy, if you are a board director, typically you're expected to hold those. You can't trade them. So it's more about when you roll off, you will have this. To me, there's a lot in there about thinking about your future investment impact. I'm glad we're talking about this because for me, this happened later than I think it can happen for most women to start thinking about the impact of their retirement beyond 401k.
I love that. Leilani, just on that point, when would you recommend people start looking at boards and getting into this type of work?
5 to 10 years before they want them. Your network is the strongest while you're an operator. While you're operating, people trust you, they see what you're doing, they see the value of what you're doing, and the number one way to get a board role is typically through your network, through someone you know, which is why women have not gotten so many seats in the boardroom because they're not on the golf course, but the guys that are giving the seats, right, or finding people. So it's very important early on to let people know that you're interested, that it's something you're thinking about. And I believe that as an operator, you bring a perspective to the boardroom that's super important. CEOs want to know what other CEOs are doing, right? They want to know how other companies are solving the problems that they might be struggling with. And if you're 15 years retired, you're not solving those problems day to day. So you can give great strategic guidance, but I think that combination is super helpful.
Absolutely. What great tips. And I think we'll get further into this conversation. But before we do, Leilani, would you introduce yourself and share a few pivotal moments that have really impacted who you are today?
Great. So I'm Leilani Latimer. I'm a C-suite executive, board director, and strategic advisor. I've spent my career building and scaling technology or purpose-led organizations, and almost always at moments of change, growth, or reinvention. I would say, though, in my lifetime, it's interesting, pivotal moments. Number one, deciding not to go to law school after undergraduate school. I had planned to go to law school. That was my plan all along. And I took a gap year between undergraduate and law school and changed my mind. So that pivotal moment led to my next pivotal moment, which was moving to Italy. I moved to Italy where I planned to spend a few months, learn the language, explore some work opportunities, and I ended up spending 15 years there and naturalizing as an Italian citizen. My third big pivotal move was moving to San Francisco 25 years ago and really leaning into the tech world where learning never stops.
Oh my gosh, that's so fun. You set us up well for this conversation. Leilani, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Santa Barbara, California.
And how did you, as you were a young person in Santa Barbara, how did you start learning about money?
Let me start by saying what money means to me, because since I've been a child, it's really synonymous with independence, which means power over your choices, the ability to make independent choices, and flexibility. I learned a lot in my early childhood about this. And what's interesting is I learned a lot about saving and managing money. And I only learned about investing later in life, which is why I encourage people to learn about it earlier. So my dad was the money manager in our household. And both he and my grandmother were obsessed with balancing their checkbooks. Literally,
so
they
that's
loved
managing. Yes.
Oh, yeah. They both taught me early on that you don't buy something unless you have all of the money to buy it. In fact, I remember them talking about layaway programs, which is very different from buy now, pay later. It was pay now and get the item when you have fully paid it off at the store, and then you can go get it. So I would say I learned that lesson from them. And also, I would say paying off your credit cards and having no debt. So when I was in college, I watched my dad bail a family member out of credit card debt. So I also learned that to this day, I pay my credit card off every month. I have never not paid off my credit card every month. So balancing that virtual checkbook. But I would also say living in Italy taught me a similar philosophy, which is this combination of being conservative and making smart purchasing investments. I learned to invest in fewer but very high quality clothing items. In Italy, you have one great coat and it lasts you 20 years. You pay a lot of money for it, but it's one great coat that's going to last you 20 years. You have 2 pairs of great shoes, not 200. So this idea of it's better to have one really good item and invest in your, let's say clothing, right? Something that's really going to last you is also very, again, I learned that in Italy. Italians always look great, but I'm going to tell you, I have some of my best Max Mara suits. They're 20 years old and they look like they're brand new when I wear them. But also what I would add is that both of my parents came from modest upbringings. I was raised in a very comfortable household, but I was expected to work, always work for my weekly allowance. I think summer job conversations started around Easter time. So never were we allowed to sort of lounge around the house and not work. And so that's really where that financial independence came in. But, I'll also share a story that I think is interesting because I want to talk about money and relationships. That has definitely shaped my perspective and changed, by the way, transformed it. But my mom didn't work. She was a dance teacher, so she occasionally worked, but she was not, a full-time employee. But my dad created a separate account for her so that she could spend independently. I reflect on that and think about, we forget that 1950s housewives had to ask their husbands for money to go grocery shopping. And he did that to give her independence. So she didn't have to, ask to buy things. I saw that and I wanted to have my own independence with money, right? I didn't ever want to be in a position, even, as a kid, tell my mom I wanted to buy something and she'd say, when you have your own money, you can buy it. I'm not buying it for you. And so I was like, oh, then I better go get my own money. And so I had my jobs early on. I did everything. I went and ironed for a neighbor for $5 an hour. I babysat. My first official job was at McDonald's. I sewed bikinis for a local bikini factory because I learned how to sew in home economics in like 8th grade. The things that I did were always about making sure I had my own money. And even on family vacations, our parents would give us like a set amount of money to buy, souvenirs or postcards. And, I always came home with leftover money.
Leilani, I want to go to the period of time when you went to Italy. You were thinking law school and you made a big pivot. What role, if any, did money play in that pivot?
I wanted to self-sustain as much as I could. So the time when I was back in the States thinking about what I was going to do with my life, very, very scary time. I had 2 jobs. I had a day job that was sort of the resume job, and then I worked at restaurants at night. I worked at restaurants when I was in college as well. It's good money. It's easy to do. You can do it after the hours, the study hours or other work hours. And I had set aside enough money to self-sustain, but my parents were also very supportive of, go do this thing, figure it out, and we'll give you a certain amount of time where we'll be your backstop if you run out of money. When I got to Italy, I quickly learned I could teach English for cash. I'm scrappy. I did what it took before I actually got into, a real job.
And were you thinking when you moved to Italy that it would be more of a gap year type experience, or were you planning to find permanent employment there?
I thought it would be a 3 to 6 month. Yeah, so like a gap year. I had studied French all through college. I actually lived my official year in between undergraduate and graduate school. I lived in France and worked at a restaurant. And then I traveled through Italy and I heard Italian and thought, oh, I learned the wrong language. I needed to learn Italian. I just fell in love with the language and the culture. So I wanted to spend some time there to pick up the language. And if I could find a job, that would be great. But I think I always had in my future vision of myself that I would do something international. I was planning to do international law. I had no idea what that meant, but that's what I was planning
Love
to
the
do.
international.
So I think the whole I wanted to do something international. I was good with languages. I liked learning about other cultures. It really fed my just innate curiosity about people and language and communication. So there was no master plan, but yeah, I thought it might be a gap year.
Leilani, in Italy, I really enjoyed this perspective, this idea that when you buy something, you spend money, but you have it for a long period of time. That sounds consistent with how you were growing up. Was there anything when you were living in Italy that changed in you from a financial perspective? From their culture, what you brought on to yourself, anything that changed?
Profoundly. The middle part of my adult life, because that was my adult life, right? Living in Italy, I bought my first home, bought my first car there, bought my first insurance policy there. So all the things you do as a quote unquote grown up. The most pivotal experience was, and that had a profound impact on how I think about money and how I think about it now. So it was sort of the catalyst for what then needed to be a transformation was I was house poor. So I was living in Italy. By then, I had a great job. I was at the beginning of my career and married life and doing well economically, right? So my living expenses were not super high, was able to save a bit. And my ex-husband and I bought a flat in Rome. And this was a very exciting step and commitment for me. I felt I had, done the things that the independence. And just for context, when we got our mortgage, interest rates were between 12 and 14%, variable, but they couldn't go over 14%. When we sold it, they probably, which was not much later, but they had gone down to about between 7 and 8. But, context of the time. And within the first year of owning our home, my ex-husband lost his job. And he was unemployed for the next 2, almost 3 years. So I was faced with making monthly payments on my salary alone, which covered it, but didn't leave much for discretionary spending. And I have never felt more trapped in my life. Luckily for me, I was good at managing money and good at being on a budget, but the anxiety that I had around money and around what we could or could not afford to do, it was crippling. And when we divorced and sold the place, I wanted to buy him out. I think mostly just because of, after all those struggles, I couldn't come to terms with the loss, the failure, really. But when we sold it, I was so relieved and I felt that new sense of independence. That's when I bought my, first own car, just mine. Up to that point, I'd always shared a car with somebody. I rented and decorated my own apartment. I took some super fun trips, bought myself some new work clothes, all guilt-free. So that was a big learning experience. But then I really had to transform my relationship with money. I mean, that you don't get over that anxiety quickly.
Absolutely.
And how I thought about how married couples should manage money and expenses. So this is, to me, a real transformation and not overnight, of course. So the younger me thought that couples should split everything 50-50, which is not the same thing as sharing.
Say more about
And
that.
let me clarify
Say
that.
more about that.
It
Yeah.
was a big learning experience for me. So when I got divorced, we sold the house. My ex got his half of the house, despite my having paid for all of the mortgages all by myself. And that felt really unfair to me because I felt like I had given, blood, sweat, and tears, lots of tears to that place. And I thought the couples going 50-50 was the same thing as sharing, but that is not the case. So I really had to think about how money is managed in a functioning relationship and what would work for me. And I did reflect back on my parents. Yes, my dad was the money controller, but there was never a yours, mine in the way they talked about money. They contributed to the family in different ways. I knew I didn't want a house husband, that I wanted a partner who worked and was ambitious in his career and would share the burden of the household with me, right? So share. But I had to realize that there's no 50-50. And in a partnership, there's fluctuation. Each person contributes differently and differently isn't 50-50. So it has to feel equal. It has to feel fair, but not be a mathematical equation. I would say my husband of now 26 years, he has a very different relationship with money and his perspective has evolved too, but he doesn't like to talk about money.
I want to stop you right there because this is very interesting because after your first marriage, you were really focused on money. You had a very traumatic, it sounds like, experience with that house and wanting to protect yourself from this. You just rationalized all these really wonderful things and attributes you wanted. And now you're with somebody who doesn't like to talk about money. How did you guys move forward?
Even more than that is when we moved to San Francisco, why moving to San Francisco is pivotal, is we got together and he's a lifetime entrepreneur, had just come out of launching a business in Montreal, was coming back to Italy. And he was like, I want to start a new business, but I don't want to start it in Italy. And we said, let's do something totally new together. We thought, where do we want to be? We want to come to the US and find something new and exciting. And I decided, well, probably best that one of us comes with a job. So I actually ended up being relocated by my company. At that point, I'd spent 10 years working for Sabre, an American technology company. They relocated me to the US. We chose San Francisco because it was the year 2000 and the internet technology
It's
world was
exciting.
booming. And we're both, really big on technology. But I mean, our move was he came with nothing. So it was a big new adventure and very, courageous of both of us. And yet at that point, I was okay with, okay, I'll be the one with a stable job. You can figure things out. I knew I had beside me a person who would support me and share the burden, whatever the burden was going to be.
Is that because you were talking about it in a different way than your first husband?
Yes, and he knew that I was coming out of a traumatic situation. He knew the whole story. He knew that I needed help with some of the
Stability.
not being anxious about things. But part of it was also that I knew he was, ambitious and a driver and an entrepreneur and a, doer. Very different risk profile. If you were to, sit us down and say, what's your risk profile? His is like 100. Right? That's the entrepreneur is, everything is upside. Mine is not just because of the experience, but because of upbringing, more on the conservative side. But yeah, so that was a big pivotal move. But somehow we were both just ready to make that adventure happen.
It sounds like an adventure. And I just want to point out, you're moving from country to country. There's different laws. There's all kinds of different tax regimes. This is not easy. It's pretty complicated.
They're not taking the easy route. No.
Let me tell you, when I sat down with, so again, Sabre's a company at the time with $3 billion company, technology company serving the global travel industry. I moved, but they had to sever my Italian contract and I got a severance payment. I was never an expat. I was always a local hire because by then I was already a resident by the time they hired me. So I had to sever my Italian contract and then be hired on an American contract. My first time ever seeing health benefits and the 26 pages that someone needs to walk you through to understand PPO, HMO, because again, socialized medicine with an integrated program that the company gets you in Italy, very, very different. Stuff I had never done because I had never worked in the US except, as a young person, right? So same thing with insurance, same thing with renting. They had given me a package where we had, a real estate agent help us find a place to rent, but it was the year 2000. I had to write a renter's resume.
Yes, you did.
And people wanted to see my credit. Well, and they wanted to see my credit history, which, by the way, I had been living in another country for 15 years. So it was squeaky clean. Good thing is I kept a credit card. So I got a credit card when I moved to Italy. My own credit card, but I had my dad as a cosigner because, you're living in another country. The internet had not happened yet. So these things were really cumbersome and difficult to manage money across borders. But luckily I had credit, but it was like I hadn't done anything. I had not transacted, which is a very interesting thing about credit, right? So it was difficult from that perspective is I show up and I'm, again, a person with no credit history really. And then I sit down with the benefits person. They say, what do you mean you've never had a 401k? And I'm like, this is my first 401k. I've been paying into a different system for the last 15 years. So it is interesting, Sandy, to your point, that you have to think about, again, luckily the sale of the house, all of that had happened from a transaction perspective. I'm sure this won't surprise you. I kept every tax receipt. I only shredded my Italian pay stubs of God knows how many years ago, like 2 years ago when I was cleaning stuff out of the garage. I'm like, oh, look, every pay stub I ever got and every tax filing I ever faxed. So I scanned a whole bunch of stuff and then I shredded a bunch of stuff. But it is interesting sort of starting from scratch later on something like a 401k or, again, trying to understand a healthcare system that we in the U.S. criticize socialized medicine, and yet I was on it for 15 years, and I'm going to say, not so bad, folks. And our system is certainly not any better, actually.
Leilani, I want to get to a comment you made about needing to change your relationship with money. Would you describe how you did that? That's a very difficult thing to do. And where are you today?
So I think it was really understanding not to get, this is not a lot to do with money, but it does have a lot to do with a relationship, is understanding this sharing concept in a relationship. And, as women, we know that we bear a lot more of the burden of home tasks. I've always been, and I encourage younger couples to outsource everything that can be outsourced so that it doesn't become a you should do this, I should do this conversation. So part of that is that, like, what does sharing look like? Then it's the independence. So what will make the two of us feel independent while sharing? I would say I still believe each person needs their own financial independence so that they can make decisions without having to ask permission. As an independent person, there's nothing worse than feeling you want to communicate and say, hey, I'm going to do this thing, or surprise, I did this thing. What you don't ever want to be is in a position of asking permission. That's the dependence that doesn't feel good on either side. So I think there's that, but then let's just be frank. When you have kids, there are so many additional expenses that trying to keep track of them in a 50-50 world would just be mayhem. When I talk to younger people in younger relationships, I say, first of all, when you start living with somebody, get someone to clean the house, because it's not my job and it's not your job, or it's both of ours jobs, or it's a third person's job. I say this as a woman because, again, why is it my job and not your job? Why is taking out the trash? And this happens when you have then, a male and a female child, is how do you start thinking about household chores and who does what? I grew up with a sister. There was no brother in the house. So household chores were all chores. So you don't realize some of the gendering that happens even with your kids. So what I think is a good idea is to have a joint family account for all of the household expenses: cleaning, babysitting, dry cleaning, doctor's bills. Again, making sure that we do less of the unpaid labor if possible, especially if you're working, right? And you've chosen to work. And then talking really openly about the division of labor and, kind of finding that neutral zone for the things that can't be outsourced. Someone will have to take the children to the doctors. Someone will have to take the car to the shop. Right? Those are things that can't really, I guess they can be outsourced, but you probably don't want to outsource everything. So I think it's, having those conversations. But for me, it really was, my personal transformation was around being able to build up trust in a person and trust in myself. And then thinking about always, and it's interesting, when you get out of a relationship, the healthiest thing I think that can happen is for the other person not to have had a lot of faults, because that forces you to think about who you want to be in your next relationship, as opposed to being, oh, that person did this thing, or that putting it on the other person, because that's our opportunity to say, well, did you like yourself in that relationship? And I will tell you, no, I didn't like having to be controlling. I didn't like myself in that relationship. So it was actually imagining a future me and who I wanted to be in a future relationship. And then money, of course, is then how will you manage that thing that needs to be talked about? And again, today I'm fine actually because my husband doesn't like to talk about money, I'm fine managing the money. I don't do it with any kind of anxiety. It's a task, but it's a task, he does other tasks.
Leilani, thank you for your vulnerability and sharing your insights and your experiences. I think that's really important. You've given us and our listeners so much to think about. And I'm curious, what is your next money conversation going to be, and who will it be with?
It is, and it will always be with my kids. So my children have both just now graduated from college. I have a 21 and a 22-year-old.
Congratulations.
And I am trying to teach them early on, not just about saving, but also about investing. So that to me is the big, again, I was taught a lot about saving. That's the sort of, right, balancing that checkbook. But I think thinking about investing earlier is important. Today I'm an LP in a couple of venture funds. And I think thinking beyond the 401k has been, it's actually been super fun for me because, again, when I do the annual review with our financial planner, my husband likes to do some angel stuff. I prefer to do some venture stuff, right? So there's a difference in betting on one horse or betting on a fund that's betting on multiple horses.
See that risk differential that you were describing pop up there.
Mm-hmm. When my kids were born, I immediately invested in 529s for them. So the education fund And today we set them up with index funds so they can start thinking about their own, investments. Again, they'll get a 401k at some point. When I talk to young people, I tell them when your first employer offers you a 401k and that there's a match, because not everybody does a match, but if they do a match, max it out every year. Won't make sense to you now, but again, one day if you want to buy a house, you may be able to use that. There are things you can do with it. And then, for me personally, I've been able to invest in funds that are focused on female founders. To me, that's really important. If 2% of venture funding goes to female founders, that's very, very small. I think learning early on, and my kids have the benefit of having grown up in a technology entrepreneurial household where we talk about venture capital a lot because we're in the Silicon Valley. I don't think everybody has that conversation. I think for a lot of women, they don't know that venture capital can be part of their investment portfolio. Being able to choose what you invest in, being able to choose where you donate your money, being able to choose how you spend your money. To me, this is the choices, having the financial freedom to make those choices. And for me, I started with a no harm portfolio. So I started with, I don't want any funds that have tobacco, firearms, or oil and gas. But on the oil and gas, I had to be careful because I really wanted to invest in renewable energy. And a lot of those companies have mixed portfolios.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, I wanted to invest in the female CEO ETF, Hypatia, which is the ETF that has all of the publicly traded companies run by female CEOs. And one of them was an oil and gas company. So I was like, okay, I'll make an exception for her. So being able to make those choices, again, it started as no harm, but then it moves into intentional. If I have the opportunity to, again, make purchasing choices, contribution choices, and then investment choices, that to me is then the evolution of independence.
Oh my gosh.
Teaching my kids that early, but just on the check balancing, I built Excel sheets for them while they were in college to track all of their 529 expenditures. And I told them, use this. And again, like I've gone to speak to an econ class at UC San Diego, which is my alma mater. And I told them, like, you need to know your burn now. Your parents may be paying for it, but you need to know what your monthly burn rate is, because when you get your first job, you need to figure out how much you typically spend on rent and utilities. So I still see it as sometimes it's survival, sometimes it's in support of a cause, and sometimes it's treating yourself to an amazing gift, but you need to know what that balance is.
Oh my gosh. You're having many money conversations. I think it's incredible with your kids, with yourself, your husband, students. What a gift to these students. It's incredible. Leilani, where's the best place for our listeners to find you?
Are you saying LinkedIn?
Yeah. Is LinkedIn a good spot?
LinkedIn. I also have a website, LeilaniLatimer.com.
Okay, wonderful. Well, it has been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation on Money Tales. Sandy already hit on the vulnerability that we can learn from so much of what you shared, and thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Cami, what a fun conversation we just had with Leilani Latimer.
She's special.
She is, and she brought up so many things. I think off the bat, her comments about people looking to join boards of companies, whether they're public or private, and thinking about that journey and beginning to prepare yourself for it if it's something you want to achieve earlier in your career. I thought that was really interesting.
Mm-hmm. And not waiting till, which could be your mindset, I'll do that when I retire. But I appreciated her saying that. That's too late almost.
Right. There's a lot of benefits that you can provide to another company if you're actively working in one, especially for folks who are managing P&Ls, profit and loss statements, if you're not familiar with that term.
And you're more attractive. Isn't that part of what she was saying? You're more attractive
you're more attractive. You're more plugged into what's going on.
Yeah. That was a great point. And here's something that stuck out for me, Sandy, when she talked about living in Italy and the idea of buying your clothing and spending a lot of money on it, but not buying many items. And I remember when I was a kid, I studied abroad and had the opportunity to go down to Italy. And I was meeting up with a friend of my cousin's, and she was dressed beautifully. And then she took me back to her apartment, and it was tiny. So kind of to Leilani's point, like not big closets, tons of clothes. And I thought, what an important lesson for all of us that Leilani highlighted about that it doesn't, this fast fashion movement where we buy items because they're kind of trending and then you're not going to wear them again in 6 months or a year. It's sort of a shame. And it really resonated with me because I do get in, but it's such a good deal. And so I buy quantity sometimes, and I appreciated her comment about quality. And it's kind of a good outlook on life. Buy quality, invest in even your clothes.
Yeah, me too, especially in those times when you're ready to purge your closet and you're like, oh my gosh, why did I buy all these things?
So true,
it's
Sandy.
Ridiculous. Kemi, I want to just finish off this episode by highlighting the money conversation insights here. I really appreciated that Leilani shared with us how her money conversations have evolved throughout her life, and particularly as she moved from one marriage onto the next one, and how she learned so many things about talking about money honestly and openly, and brought those learnings into her next relationship. And even though her current husband sounds like someone who doesn't really like to talk about money, she's been able to have effective conversations with him and make sure that they're both aligned and on the same page, and that they're not rigidly splitting all of their responsibilities 50-50. They're figuring out what makes sense for one of them to take on versus the other, and checking in and moving forward very effectively, it sounds like.
So true. Thanks for sharing that outtake, Sandy, and the idea that life is lumpy. And so sometimes 50-50 is too perfect. And, you might have to step in at this period of life and the other person will step in at another period. No, it was so special. I'm really so thankful that Leilani joined us on Money Tales.
It's a great conversation. Please share this with your friends if you enjoyed it. And we'll see you next time on Money Tales.
Thanks for listening to the Money Tales podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, share it with someone you think would benefit from listening. And leave us a review on your favorite podcasting platform. Your ratings and reviews help more people find our podcast. If you're inspired to gain clarity and peace of mind about financial matters, don't hesitate to reach out to our team at Aspirient. Go to aspirient.com/start a dialogue. Or you can email Sandy and me at podcasts@aspirient.com. See you next time.